First of all, before I start with getting into the actual slides and the presentation, I want to provide a little bit of context for why doing this kind of analysis at the level that's been done is interesting or was important to us. My colleagues at the illicit crop monitoring center in Colombia and my colleague in the University of South Carolina. In 2007, following many, many years of evaluation, this program that was funded by the United States actually was funded by Congress, moved by Senator Leahy from Vermont, to evaluate the environmental effects of the fumigation to eradicate coca in Colombia, concluded and presented its paper and submitted it, and it came out in a very prestigious journal. And so their conclusion, it was the environmental effects, toxicology to people, to animals, it was a broad evaluation, and it was completely text-based. It wasn't based on any, on a very little new collection of data. It was based mostly on things that other people had done and sort of putting them together and releasing this evaluation. This evaluation concluded that the environmental effects of fumigation were close to nil compared to the environmental effects that are coming out of the coca plantations themselves. And that therefore, the government should go ahead, and there's no real problem with using this herbicide in the program, which has been the feature that's mobilized a lot of activism here in the United States. Now, this talk is not going to present data because we've had difficulty obtaining the data about fumigation, but it informs some aspects of that, of what are the environmental effects of the growers versus the environmental effects of the fumigation, and how could we tease those apart. It's actually very complicated. The second part of the context is that the Illicit Crop Monitoring Center of Colombia, which is funded by the United Nations, they, a couple of years ago, they realized that coca eradication wasn't really working. And I'll show some data to that. And that the reason why, they wondered if the reason why it wasn't working was because growers were important. And perhaps if we go ask the growers, we will discover why we can have less coca and more cocaine coming out of Colombia. And that was a huge paradox in their minds, and let's go ask the growers. So they conducted some surveys, and they randomized samples and went and talked to the growers. And lo and behold, they discovered certain patterns in the growers that did not fit the expectations of the eradication programs. So one thing that from the standpoint of environmental biologist that I am, stood out in that evaluation is that they did not try to seek a control group. So they did not try to see whether the behavior of these coca growers was in any way different from the behavior of any other people who might be growing any other thing. And they couldn't do it because that's not the question they were wanting to answer. They just wanted to answer the question, how can coca growers produce more cocaine in less area? That was the question. And so that is something that this provides a little bit of a gross baseline for those comparisons between the people who grow the coca and the people who don't. Now, just to, okay, how do I, oh, that's right, it's not here. Okay, so just to,
I think you have to move it. I noticed that Nancy was using a rather unusual technique of sort of moving it over from here.
How does that work? Okay. And so here's the organization of the talk, and in case you feel like you've nodded off and you've dozed off for a little bit of the talk, especially the methodological parts of it, then when we keep coming back at these slides, and you're going to see some of the images of the vertical integration that was mentioned in the abstract, but that probably is going to be left for the question time in this presentation. I wanted to put this picture there from the Organ Pipe National Monument in Arizona, of a car of some alleged cocaine smugglers at the border, to emphasize the international nature of this problem, or this environmental, or the connections that this has that are transnational, and they're not limited to any single nation. And the policies that happen in the border with Mexico and at Organ Pipe have an effect everywhere else, and have an effect in Colombia and in Peru and in Bolivia, but we're just focusing on Colombia. So first I'm going to start with the relationship between, sorry, I'm trying to get used. Relationship between the forest and coca. Yes. Okay. So the coca plots until now and this is changing, this is rapidly evolving, have been preferentially planted in the forest throughout Colombia. There is really very minimal overlap. Usually when I give this, I think this audience is very sophisticated, but when I give this to a general audience, this kind of talk, at the end there will be somebody raising their hand and saying, well, why don't the coca growers just grow coffee? And they don't realize that geographically, environmentally, these are places that are completely different. The places where the famed coffee comes from and the places where the famed cocaine comes from are completely different. So there's really a very minimal overlap. When I started looking at this phenomenon, I used to think that there should be some positive environmental externalities. That is, I expected that because coca is so efficient and it's producing such high income, such high profits for the growers, that then people would need to use less area, and so coca was actually so much better than so many other things that they could be doing, like having cattle, or they could be, I don't know, planting cotton or whatever else they could be planting, and there had to be some positive environmental externalities. But it turns out, and I'll show some data to bear on that, that because there is no overlap, or there's very little overlap between the places where people grow things that are traded and that are commodities for cash crops, and the places where people grow the illegal commodity of coca, then there's really no positive environmental externalities come of it. So most of them are really negative environmental externalities. So these are the data that they have been collected by the monitoring center, showing the replacement of forest cover in the blue and the red over time. The blue is second growth forest and the red is primary forest, over time being replaced by coca. And as you can see, growers seem to have become a lot more efficient at the use of the forest. So they started out with a high use, 40% of the clearings for coca were being in the forest. And as time has gone by, there's only 10% of all of the land that's being used for coca that is replacing primary forest. Now, of this forest that is replaced by coca, some of it reverts back to succession. About a little bit less than half reverts back to the succession. So there's a turnover that's happening in this environment, but it's not very clear environmentally. Well, it is clear environmentally that in any case, we are following a hollow frontier in which you're getting deeper and deeper into the forest. And I would argue that that's happening because of the repression that's attached to fumigation. But again, the evidence is difficult to come by. Now, in Colombia, coca has really spread far and wide. It was initially concentrated just in the Amazonian lowlands of Colombia. Is this it? Oh, yeah. Oh, oops. Sorry. Can you go back? Yeah. Yes. It was initially concentrated just in this region here in Colombia. And as of the year 2000, it started expanding over the Andes onto the other side to these forests that, in terms of biodiversity, have much higher value. They have a lot more species. They're a lot more threatened. There's a lot less of them. And that has continued to grow. These are data for, these are coca for 7 years. And as they get darker, they get more recent. And they get lighter, they get older. Now, the current areas of rapid expansion are actually among the rivers in the Amazon and Orinoco Basin of Colombia. But significantly, there are vast areas of Andean forests, of intermontane forests here, that are growing, as well as the spread into the Choco biogeographic region. So to move on to the policy response to Coca cultivation, and this is what a field that's been fumigated looks like a couple of years down the line. These are all pictures coming out of the monitoring program. So the policy response to coca cultivation has been eradication. Most of the eradication shown here, shown up here, happens through aerial fumigation with the herbicide Roundup. It's done from airplanes, and it's supposed, according to the report that was published in 2007, it's extremely precise and wonderful, and it really doesn't affect people very much. Now, there's something interesting about putting these two graphs together, which the United Nations has never done in its reports, and which also the Monitoring Center hasn't done, and it's that you notice in 2000, when the Clinton administration pushed for Plan Colombia, and Colombia pushed for Plan Colombia to get all this money to go in full into the eradication, because there's so much cocaine coming out of Colombia, there were about 160,000 hectares planted with coca plantations in Colombia, right? But in the year 2006, the last year we have data for, there's only 86,000 or 85,000, but more than 200,000 had been eradicated. So in reality, by 2006, we had something like 300,000 hectares of some form of coca, the majority of which had been eradicated. And this has been lauded as a huge success. Now, isn't that interesting? Manual eradication has really taken on recently because people are really allergic to the idea of taking their cocaine with herbicide. No, mostly because there's a lot of activism going into it, and the security situation has changed so that people can actually go in and try to eradicate manually. So it's been growing by leaps and bounds, and there's also alternative development programs that go into these focal areas to try and set up situations where people can switch to other crops. And the way that these organizations and the way that these programs have been set up, it really is a model that I'm going to call the invasive plant model. And it's that treating coca like it's an invasive species, that you can get rid of it with herbicide. The growers don't really have much adaptation. They really don't have a lot of agency. Most of the growers anyway are recent immigrants. They're people that are just a floating population that go around. A lot of them were perhaps formerly urban unemployed, that during the 1990s there were a lot of jobs lost, there was a lot of violence, and so they lost their jobs, and they decided to make a quick buck and go plant coca, which is very easy. So it's completely driven just by the economics of the coca. And in all other respects, the illegal growers are very similar to legal growers. They just need to make the switch. They just need to stop being so greedy. Because they're so greedy, they just want to make a quick buck. So they just need to make that switch, and they can shift and join the global economy through legal markets. So this is kind of the model that goes into trying to create these conditions for alternative development. Okay, finally getting the hang of this. But it turns out that coca is not an invasive species. Coca is actually a high-value commodity. It's a crop. It's something that people use. It's a resource. And so the expansion of coca actually depends entirely on people right now in Colombia. The environment may also play a role, and I've done some work to show that, but it really depends on what people do. People vary, the environment varies, and that's what we're trying to get at with this exercise in understanding the human and the environmental geography of coca. So this is something that I was, like the picture that I was telling you about, illustrating some aspects of the vertical integration, and that I hope to discuss in the question session. And by characterizing, well, and for now we're moving on to characterizing the growers using spatially explicit methods. And in the last few years in biogeography, there has been a huge expansion of methods that are called climate envelope models or environmental niche models that help us understand the biogeography of species, the ecological biogeography of species. So I decided to use this tool because it was important for me to take into account that coca is not going to grow everywhere, just like coffee doesn't grow everywhere. So I took environmental data. Actually, one of the problems that I never have when I'm doing my other evolutionary studies is that I had so much data for where the coca was grown that the program choked and I couldn't do it. And so I had to take 5,000 random points instead of taking MR. There was so much coca. Imagine like it's 7 years of data, and each year has at least 100,000 little plots. And so when you added them on the aggregate, the program just couldn't cope with so much information. So I had to randomize and just randomly pick some that I'm illustrating here in this map of Colombia. This is aggregated over the 7 years. And I included a bunch of environmental variables that anything from rainfall, patterns of temperature, patterns of vegetation, things like that. And here are the results. So essentially, there are vast areas where coca could expand further, as you can see here in Amazonia. So everything that's darker, everything that's not light blue like this, has the potential to have coca in it environmentally. Environmentally, coca could expand into all these places if, because the environmental conditions are right. Of course, we know that species don't quite behave that way, but that's just, for the sake of analysis. You can see there are vast regions where it could expand further in the Chocó, further in Amazonia and the Orinoco Basin, and here in what we Colombians call the Magdalena Medio. This is no man's land of conflict in northern Colombia. the models were significant, et cetera, et cetera. I'm not going to dwell on it. So to characterize the growers, I decided to put together the information on where the coca grows with the data that were generated by the census in 2005, as well as other series of social surveys that would help us get the information about the growers or get an approximate profile of what the growers are like and what are they like in comparison to other people, other rural populations that are not in regions where the coca is grown. So really it's a comparison, it's a geographic comparison between two areas. But by proxy, we're trying to get at the people who live in those areas and who work in those areas. So we took up different variables only for the dispersed rural population, not for people who lived in the town, but just for the dispersed rural population. And there's a welfare survey that was done in 2005. It's actually done every year for the allocation of welfare benefits, whatever they may be in Colombia. That classifies people into three categories: misery, poverty, and neither, above, let's say. Better off than miserable or poor. And then a bunch of information that we expected to be relevant because of this model, this invasive species model, or the model of thinking that these are all immigrants. So it was important for us to see if people were moving because they were unemployed, they were moving into that locality because they were unemployed, if they were moving out, if they were illiterate, and all of this information. Plus, of course, the data, the model, the spatial model that we had generated from the environmental niche analysis. And another variable that I've always wanted to look at and not only recently became proficient enough to at least get an approximation of is the cost of access to market. And this was a function that was generated taking into account calling markets every city that was over 300,000 people and that could be accessed by roads using the road network. And the cost function took into account all of these conditions, the distance to the road, the change in elevation. So it costs a lot more. If you have the same unit of distance, it costs a lot more to move across a huge cordillera than it costs to go downhill or it costs to go just in a flat area. So, and that's what the accessibility looks like by road. So all of these variables combined together and compared, so because we're comparing across two types of agriculture, then we needed to get some information of the other agriculture, the legal agriculture. So I used some layers that had been generated a few years back, but that were, if we make the simplifying assumption, and I know that it's a stretch, but it actually makes sense in the context of Colombia, that most of the growth of agriculture, agriculture in the frontier is happening because of illegal agriculture and not because of legal reasons. If we make that simplifying assumption, then we can generate this and generate the spatial information to analyze these two groups. And I'm going to have a couple of these. I don't know what's happening to my computer. Never mind. I'm going to have a couple of these, but I just want to point out that in each one of these histograms, the top one is the one showing the illegal agriculture, and the bottom one is the one showing the legal agriculture. And so most of the people that are in regions where there is illegal agriculture are actually living in misery with high levels. There's a lot of percentage of misery, and this is a little bit of an outlier group. And when you have high levels of misery here too, but you have a long tail of something more equitable where there's just a little bit less misery in there. And then when you get to the density of the population, I'm not going to show every single variable. Like, it's just, this is just for the sake of showing some of the more salient patterns. When you look into population density, and I want to point out that this is a logarithmic scale, so from here to here it's 10 times more, and it's 10 times more, and it's 10 times more. The population density in the illegal cultivation areas is actually quite small when you compare the population density in the legal cultivated areas. So it's very difficult, in principle, to develop internal markets for a place that's actually not densely populated at all, because what are you going to sell? Who are you going to sell to? There aren't a lot of people there. And finally, this is the last one of these, I promise. And finally, in terms of accessibility, and this is a question that I've had for a long time, is if the coca weren't there, would some of these places be cleared? And the answer is actually clearly no, because when you have the legal agriculture, the mode for cost of access is zero. So the legal agriculture is very close to market, and the majority of it is very close to market. And the illegal agriculture has this long tail of between 1/4 and 1/3 of the illegal cultivation is completely beyond any legal market. So these are places where there's no way to make any legal replacement of the illegal agriculture because the cost of access is simply too high. Okay? So just to summarize all of this, the indicators were pretty much the way that we thought they would be. For the coca areas, there's more misery plus poverty, so people are falling into the misery plus poverty. The unemployment showed an interesting pattern where unemployment for females was lower and higher for males. The percentage of people who moved because of threats was higher, who had moved into that locality because of threats. Who moved because of unemployment was actually lower, which is contrary to the idea that these are all urban unemployed that have moved there recently. And interestingly, the people who had left the area was higher. That means these places were losing people rather than gaining people. So again, contrary to what was expected. And the cost of access by road or by river was actually high. Now, the fact that a lot of these were significant doesn't mean that they're all that important. And the reason for that is because you have 5,000 data points in one side and 5,000 data points, you get a significant value, and the difference between one and the other is 0.05%. So, I decided to get rid of all those things that were kind of like that, and these are the grade ones are the ones that sort of didn't make it into a general model. And so when we combine all the variables together to make a model that will help us explain what variables are correlated to the coca plantations, we see that actually the percentage who moved because of threats is not significant, and unemployment isn't either. So we've completely lost the unemployment variable. Unemployment has nothing to do with it at all. Instead, all the other ones, things like access, things like the environmental model, things like the number of people that are leaving, those things are significant and are actually good predictors of where this, and this model, just for the sake of this, has got area under the curve in the receiver operating curve of 0.83, which means that, more than 0.7 is okay, and we would prefer to have more than 0.9, so it's okay. It's not fantastic, but it's pretty good. And if we take some of the elements, like the social variables or the niche model that we created, then we lose a little bit of the explanatory power. In other words, we need both things. We need the social variables, we need the environmental variables to be able to explain where the coca is. So now to move on to the conclusions and the implications for policy, we see that in general, the prospects for people who are in the coca growing area are worse than the prospects for people who are not in the coca growing area. Now, of course, it's a bit of a no-brainer, but it actually wasn't known because there was no baseline for comparing these two populations. Migration in the coca growing areas is actually more dynamic, but it's not more dynamic because they have all these urban unemployed coming and becoming coca growers. It's more dynamic because people are leaving. That's why it's more dynamic. And the cost of access effectively impedes the switch to local markets, the switch to legal markets in a lot of cases. It's going to impede it in something like a quarter to a third. And so just to wrap things up, it's really interesting, the conceptualization. When you actually, I know that this isn't necessarily original, but you have declared war on a plant. You have a policy that is a war on a plant. Think about that, a plant. And so are you going to have a war on a plant, and does that make sense? It doesn't really make sense because a war on a plant means that there is a way to constrain that plant and to reduce that plant that is somehow environmental. And in reality, the environmental nature of this plant is huge. There is a lot of potential for expansion of this plant as far as we can tell. Now, as you can see, the growers are becoming more efficient in their use of forest, and so coca has become normalized in a lot of these localities. It's part of the normal landscape. It could be that the brother of the mayor has a coca plantation. It could be, it really has become the norm. But the norm in this area in terms of both the social mores, obviously, but also the situation in the access to services is a lot worse than in all the other agricultural areas. So the social conditions are dismal, and you could make an argument for this, that some of these places, the ones that have the possibility of switching to legal agriculture, you should extend those services and thus normalize at the other stationary situation where you have no coca, right? But of course, that we would expect, if you're coming from an environmental perspective, would expect that this would have a trade-off with forest cover because it would become more attractive to move there. Now, I personally don't have a problem with that in a series of localities, but it would be definitely something that would need to be explored very carefully. Right now, what we have is a situation where the extent of the services that are being extended are simply perhaps the construction of roads here and there, but not necessarily the extension of the services that would make the social norm different from the plantation of coca. So there's a lot to do, of course. I couldn't get my hands on good spatial data on the violence. It's very difficult to get good, reliable data. And of course, we get into a problem of cause and effect. Which one was first, the violence or the drugs? And so it's going to be important to develop some kind of framework, conceptual framework for studying which one influences with the other, and to model the spatial dynamics of coca and coca fumigation, because I think that this is actually what's driving the expansion of coca further into the hinterland, not population pressure, not migration. The reason why we have more coca as every year goes by and we have to eradicate 3 times more than is actually planted is because you are going around and fumigating in the first place. So in both issues, there are some spatial problems, but I don't have that data yet, so that's fine. And with that, I would like to thank you and wait for your questions.
I'm going to take the moderators, exert my moderator's rights and ask a couple of questions. First of all, I'm wondering whether the model that Nancy proposes of the political forest might not be so useful here, because of course there was that whole march into the Amazon when in this other period actually in the early 1960s, which was in fact the sort of create a Maoist march to the interior to create escaping la violencia and everything, and that coca comes in somewhat later. So one of the things is that idea of that this is perhaps not so much about eradicating a plant, but about eradicating insurgency, and it might be useful to look at it from that perspective. Second thing, I have been to the Guaviare a couple of times, so and I always find it quite illuminating. And one of the things is that one does have the feeling that local markets don't have much relevance because there's a plane leaving every minute. Literally a plane leaving every minute. So I've never seen air traffic like that. So, so one of the things is that distance to market is, they're not taking this on mules. So the distance question is not entirely irrelevant, but it's also has to be, I think, conceptualized a little bit differently. The other thing I would say, too, is that there's this question about the globalization of a peasant product, and that really a globalization framework might help a little bit with this. And also, I saw a lot of agroforestry, coca with agroforestry. Yeah. So, and there is, of course, that long tradition in the upper Amazon of agroforestry with that. So the question, I think, is that I agree with you that the fumigation is driving a lot of this stuff forward, but I think that a lot of this needs to be viewed perhaps through some different kinds of theoretical lenses.
Right. Yes, no, I definitely agree. I think that the distance issue has to do, for me, for conceptualizing it helps me understand which are the environmental externalities. So which are the places that, other things being equal, not having the market to coca, which is the one that has those plains. There's no beef going out on those plains. There's no cassava going out on those plains. It's just coca, right? If we didn't have those, where would the fronts of colonization be if they were? Now, I know that doesn't seem very useful for understanding the phenomenon on the ground of the expansion of coca, but it is useful for understanding the fronts of environmental change in the landscape, which I'm interested in because I'm coming from the perspective of other species and perhaps threatened species and perhaps things like that. But I agree with you that in terms of understanding where coca grows and doesn't grow, the access by road and the way that it gets there is really not all that crucial because it flies out of there, and it's the only thing that can fly out of there, can be airlifted out of there.
Well, the logic of its situating there, the logic of its remoteness is part of why it's planted there.
To some extent, but But the remoteness, see, coca doesn't grow everywhere. There are vast
No.
areas of Colombia that are really the middle of nowhere. It's not grown there because there's no people there, or there's no river there, or there's, you see what I mean? So, so yes, there is something to that, but you can also make the argument that you need the people to be there in the first place. You need the campesino population to be in that place, first place. Now, as to the agroforestry, this is the reason why this kind of analysis will become passé almost overnight, because the way that the monitoring is being done, it's looking for forest cover and non-forest cover and second growth cover, and the campesinos have moved way beyond that. They are much better at adapting through vertical integration and through things like agroforestry than the organizations that are in charge of pursuing them give them credit for. So I think that definitely some of the, I don't think all of it, but some of the impetus or some of the observation of we have less area in coca, we have less area in coca is completely spurious, because we have less area in coca that we can detect through satellite imaging easily. But we may have a lot more area in coca, and that's why we still see cocaine prices have been declining worldwide. And that is a signal of a market in which either the consumption is declining, which doesn't seem to be the case anywhere in the world, or the production is increasing.
Emmanuel, you had your hand up.
Yeah, this is the question about, you made this nice image of where cocoa can grow, what the niche is.
Yes. Yeah.
I'm not sure what audience you should share that with, because they might just say, oh, that's where it can grow, let's do it all.
No, well, because again, where something can grow because of environmental variables, it's not where something will grow because the people plant the coca. So, there are other places where it won't grow, simply because there are no people there to establish the campesino economy that the things are covered. The key thing to remember here is that the model that, and I'm taking them at their face value. I know that we can put all sorts of interpretation and political discourse into it, but if you take their intentions at the face value of the fumigation and of the eradication program, then the goal is to end the production of coca, right? This is the goal, but there is no rhyme or reason to it, because it's being treated like the growers don't really exist, and it's being treated like it's an invasive species. So it's being treated like that map was the prediction. This is where all the coca is going to be. But you need a campesino economy in the first place. They're also saying these are all people coming in. These people don't know farming. That's why they plant coca. They plant coca because coca is easy to grow, and they don't know farming. It turns out they're campesinos who've been there for 2 generations. They're people who know their environment there. So they're already in place. Now, one of the questions that Susana asked that I had forgotten about the counterinsurgency is that if you take the results of Plan Colombia has been astoundingly successful in the counterinsurgency front. It has strengthened the Colombian state the way I haven't seen it in my lifetime. It's really amazing. It has strengthened the state. It's strengthened and it's weakened the guerrillas, and the guerrillas are on the retreat right now. So that has been one effect of Plan Colombia, but it has done nothing for the cocaine market. But so again, maybe that was the goal all along.
But well, one could argue.
Yeah.
But I just as a comment, again, that sort of fits in with Nancy's model of the state using these activities as a way of strengthening a state formation in a situation where you have a kind of dysfunctional state. Right. So again, and I think this goes back to the Johnson paper this morning about the use of forests and forestry in both ideologies of the state and in actual state formation in these kinds of situations. Right,
because the next step, since they now secure the area, the next step might be remove the population. And then you're...
That actually has been proposed, that in each of the families that is involved in program,
sorry, there are a few of us lining up with questions. Okay, I'm Sarah Berry from Johns Hopkins. I wonder if you could clarify a couple of things for me. You said a minute ago that many of the growers are campesinos who have been in this area for 2 generations and know about farming. But then earlier in your presentation, you said that there's no overlap. between coca and crops.
Now there
What
isn't.
were these campesinos doing before, and is this coca being grown on land people inherit from their families, or have they acquired land in other ways?
Yeah. Well, this is a really interesting question. So the simplifying assumption of separating the coca and the non-coca growing areas, and when I'm talking about farming there, I'm saying global commodities that can be traded for cash. You know, the coca, to be sure, a coca grower will have some cassava and will have some, will have a little bit of things for food and different things for shelter, etc., around their plots, right? But things that they can get their hands on that will give them cash, like coffee, or like cotton, or like rice, or like cattle. Most of them don't have those things, don't have those markets. And those legal markets are concentrated, and that's why they can be separated, because those areas that grow sugarcane, that grow all the good stuff, the stuff that can be traded and generates a lot of cash, those areas are spatially different. And what were those people doing before? They were not integrated into the global economy the way they are now. They were doing subsistence, they were doing a little bit of small-scale cattle ranching, they were having different resource uses, some of which integrated them into the economy, but not into the global economy, but not in a stable manner that coca has provided for them. Coca has provided a stability that all the other crops, with their changes in prices and their changes in the way the policies affect, if there's going to be a buyer or not, coca has done away with all that because it provides the stability. It doesn't even have to have such a huge price differential. It's just stable. You always find a buyer for your coca, and that's not true for a lot of other things. And it certainly disappeared during the 1990s. The whole network that was inherited from agrarian reform, the whole network of trying to provide some smallholder, it was never very strong and it was never very good, but trying to provide some smallholder protection, some support for those smallholder markets, that whole thing was dismantled and went away. And the thing that became the sure bet was coca.
I have a question in that, I'm Chris Boyer from UIC, that your model is based essentially on looking at coca production as any other sort of market. But I know that in other parts of the Andes, it really isn't necessarily a free market. For example, if you say at the beginning of the planting season that you're not going to grow coca, you could be in extreme problems with the people who are going to buy it. So actually, looking at this as just an economic market, when in fact there's a substantial level of coercion involved, might be somewhat it might complicate your model in some sense. Yeah. And I wonder if that actually helps to explain something that I think I understood you to say, which was that people hadn't been forced to move into the regions that you see coca being grown, but it looks like there's a lot of migration going on there. So that would seem to assume that actually a lot of people are moving out if they can. Yeah. So I'm wondering if there's maybe some sort of question of rootedness, that people really have inherited the land for multiple generations, that would make it more difficult for them to leave than for other people to leave. Therefore, they might be more susceptible to coercion to grow. I just wonder if that fits in your model.
The vulnerability of the smallholders in general, not just the coca growers, is huge. It's not just vulnerability, economic vulnerability, but vulnerability to violence, and that's why it's very difficult to extricate the effects of the coca from the effects of the violence from there. But just going back, if we take a historical long view, which there's no time in this kind of presentation to just, why I say 2 generations is because there was this march into the Amazon. There were these, some roads built. There were some titles extended to people. There were what little network existed for smallholders going into Amazonia and the Orinoco Basin back in the day, in the 60s and early 70s, like that drove people there. It wasn't forcible. So what happened is, instead of breaking up the latifundia of the places that were accessible, that were growing the good crops, instead of breaking those up, you send people off into these marginal lands from the Andes, where most of them were in the first place, without the landless people. So they've moved into this, but they have been there for a couple of generations. Enough time has gone by. Now, were they forced there? No, they were enticed there, rather, I would say. And what happens is that today, that discourse of they moved there because they were enticed there is being used politically to say these are newcomers. And because they are newcomers into the area, through eradication, they should just go back to where they came from. I've actually sat down with policymakers who just say this like this without taking into account that there's a whole history to that. And they're saying people are just coming out, they're streaming in from the cities, it's unemployed to make a quick buck there. And that's not what the data show. What the data show is that people are actually leaving these places, in part because, of course, the coca, there is a violence associated with it, with control of the markets, with paramilitaries and guerrillas fighting it out, and with situations like that. Now, about coercion, it's very difficult to extricate, but it has eased the extent to which these parallel states could effectively impose that kind of situation on people has declined somewhat. So, but it's definitely there, and it's a confounding. It doubtlessly has some compounding effect. That's why I offer this more of as a baseline to start and asking those questions and going in and actually moving and actually going in and talking to the people, which the monitoring organization kind of did. They went and talked to the people, but they didn't come with any baseline at all, and they didn't do any controls. So they were just taking information from the people, whatever they could give.
Robin?
I was just going to ask about these people who are coming in, the peasants who are working on the plantations, and what do they eat? And do they hunt? And do they go in and put in swidden plots there? And what are the other impacts that forming these villages, instant villages in these remote places is having?
Yeah. So one of the interesting things is that part of the decline that you see in the replacement of primary forest by coca is driven not just by more efficient positioning of the coca plantations and all, and perhaps by agroforestry coca, but also by the fact that the way it's quantified, it's only if it gets replaced by coca. But when people migrate into these places, they also replace some other areas of forest with sweetened cultivation. They also have they take the environmental services in the form of bushmeat. There's definitely there's going to be huge ripple effects with this Amazonian and fauna in these places, and it's definitely going to be seen a lot more in the Chocó, where there's a lot more endemicity. But there's no one measuring it right now to see those ripples of that. But right now, as it stands right now, the hectares of coca that are, all those 86,000 or so of coca have associated with them a large number of multiplier plots that have to do with other uses that are associated with the coca growers themselves, but are not just happen not to be coca.
Okay, Liliana, thank you so much. Let's